Hey folks, it's Sunday, November 16th, and it's Tinderbox Meetup with Michael Becker. I'm Tinderbox designer Mark Bernstein. The recent meetups, some of which were really excellent, the others were merely excellent, are now recorded and uploaded. So you can go to the Tinderbox forum.eastgate.com, and take a look at any meetups you missed. Thanks, Michael, for getting those up.
Well, no, and I apologize for my negligence, but the last few weeks has been brutally, crushingly brutal. So
Stuff
just
happens.
leave it at that. Yeah, so it's up now. That's good.
Uh, I've been reminded to mention from time to time that if you like this sort of thing, you might like my new book, Thinking with Tinderbox, which you can also find on the Tinderbox site at eastgate.com. Uh, and you've got something to look forward to. Tinderbox 11.1 will be out later this month. Uh, Unfortunately, we came up with a really cool new idea, so it's going to be delayed another week, but not beyond that. And this one will be worth waiting for. So clear the decks. Tinderbox 11.1 is happening. And without
And
further ado, here's Michael.
And
well, and
before
what about Winterfest or Black Friday?
Winterfest, yeah, Winterfest will happen. It will begin around December 18th, 19th.
Okay.
okay, perfect. And you want to explain a little bit what can we talk a little bit about what's going to be in Tinderbox 11? It's 11.1, is it?
Yeah,
And,
11.1.
and can you explain what Winterfest is, just so people that may not have
Sure.
heard?
Winterfest is the winter festival of artisanal software, where we get together with about a dozen other small software vendors, smallish software vendors, and offer discounts and other special deals on software direct from each individual firm. So it's a good time to find out about new software, stock up on things. There's a lot of ferment in software right now, driven in part by people aren't buying software right now. Uh, no one is entirely sure why, but especially in productivity, things are kind of bleak this year. So do stop by and take a look. Uh, in Tinderbox 11.1, I think the big news for a lot of people will be Tinderbox will now speak French and German. It may not speak it perfectly, but it is localized in two languages. And if this goes well, we'll do some other languages. It the underlying technology is now in place. There's also a big revision of hyperbolic view, basically rewritten from the ground up. And we've got the geometry right now, and the performance is much better. So that's kind of exciting too. And I think you're going to find it much more usable than in the past, especially with complicated files. Oh, those are some of the highlights. There are other highlights too, but those are the big ones.
Fantastic. Yeah, I'm sure Tom Diaz is going to love the hyperbolic view update. Maybe that will encourage him to get him back. Haven't seen him in a while. So okay, so what do we want to talk about? So typically in the Tinderbox meetups, we go around the room, new people introduce themselves. We have no one new today. And we don't have a theme today. So this is going to be a more of an ad hoc, a la carte. Let's just talk about stuff. And if we want, a la Andreas's request earlier, just talking about the how-tos of Tinderbox. It could be fun if we were to open up ATB ref, randomly grab an operator and figure out what to do with it together. Or not so randomly grab an operator. If anyone has a operator or sets of operators that they've been questioning or thinking about wanting to play with in Tinderbox, and never really spent the time doing it, I think that could be a fun exercise today as well. And if not an operator, maybe a data type like dictionaries or something like that. But let's go around the room. Who has any thoughts, ideas that they want to discuss today? Silence, crickets, no one?
You threw dictionaries on the table, which obviously raises my hackles.
Why is that?
My understanding in the world of Apple is that a dictionary is basically a JSON structure, a key value pair. Mark, is that right?
Well, that's imprecise.
Oh, no.
Jason
Oh,
has
no.
nothing to do it. Next Step has had dictionaries since Steve Jobs was at Next, and they long predate Jason. They aren't implemented in terms of Jason. Jason's a red herring, but Jason also uses attribute value lists. But remember, Tinderbox notes are attribute value lists. I understand that you don't like this terminology for, and in lots of ways, yes, it's not a
It's
great metaphor, but you need to call it something. And
right.
you'd also be complaining if Apple made up a word and called it an Appleplex.
Me? Mark,
I
please.
know.
Where's the psychologist? But
Where's-
well, because there's a whole bunch of effort. Because no one stepped up. I'll ramble until someone cuts me
Well, I think,
off.
yeah, Dave Rogers has
Let's
his hand
get Dave Rogers. You run. Pick it up, Dave.
Sure. Speaking of attributes, and I learned something today from Mark regarding when you use action code to set the value of an attribute. I think what this is kind of a best practice habit that we probably don't emphasize enough. We don't really have a list of best practices available within the community that I'm aware of. But if you have an attribute that you want to set with action code, and the intention is for that attribute to remain fixed once set, then you would use the logical operator um, uh, exclamation point equals, so that if there is a value in that attribute, the action code won't reset it. It won't create that attribute. So if there is no value, it will create the attribute, and then from then on, it should remain the same. And if you pull that note out of a container and back in, it won't fire the on and action again. So
We've actually demonstrated that several times over the last year and a half or so, and specifically around the use of prototypes when you're doing an on ad with prototypes. We can demonstrate it again too.
Well, I'm raising it as an issue that when you're thinking about designing your Tinderbox document, that what the role of the attributes are going to be, and this is kind of more of a philosophical point of view than necessarily. You have to think about what role the attribute serves going forward, and that may determine how you choose to assign that value. And that's all I have to say on it. So.
Yeah, but let's go ahead and demonstrate that really quick, because I think it's a really important utility or thing to consider. And so let me share my screen. And that particular best practice, and I kind of like what you just said, that there isn't a best practices list in the community. And I have a bunch that I've worked with before, but maybe we can go around the room and talk about what some of ours are. And we can build a best practices file today. That could be a lot of fun.
And we could put it in the forum.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that would be the whole point for that. So here we've got an open Tinderbox file. Let's go ahead and save it. This week I'll throw it on the desktop right now. I don't know. Let's put it downloads for now. TBX Meetup 16 November. Okay, so What Dave is talking about is using the pipe symbol, which is essentially an OR operator, to have Tinderbox not change the value of an attribute when an on add action or similar and the action code action is looking to interact with a value of an attribute. So let's go ahead and give an example of that. So we'll just do a really simple one first. We'll call this one note 1.
Bigger font, please, Michael.
All
And
right.
the screen. We have a complaint from the peanut.
Let's see if I can. Come on. My. Does that work? No? Yes? Better? All right.
Well, it's when you get in the action code that really,
Yeah. So let's go ahead here. Let's see if I can make this a little bigger like that. All right. So now what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and let's use the on add example that we'll call it folder 1. Call that a folder. And we'll do this one and we'll call it on add. Okay, and the on add function is what that does is whenever you add a note to another note, aka when you're adding a note to another note, that turns that other note into what we call a container. Based on the conversation we were just having, you got to call stuff something. So that's the lingo that has been used. So by adding this note to onto that note, that is adding note 1 into folder. Folder is still a note, but it's also now a container because it holds other notes. And right now we don't have any on add action code triggering that. So when I add note 1 to folder, nothing happens. So then if we add note 2, and we go back here and let's just make a simple one and we'll say color equals red, right? So what that's going to do, and I don't know how to make the font bigger for you all, but when I add note 2 to the folder, that will turn note 2 to red. Okay, so we've turned note 2 to red. Now let's change we'll say note 3, and let's make note 3's color. We can use the inspector this time just to show that example. Pull my inspector up. So if you hit Command 1, that will turn on the inspector. And we'll say, let's make the color bright green. Oops, no, that was the interior, sorry. Order interior outline. This one. Can't remember which one's the one, which one is the oh, it's this one. That's it. Bright green. Okay, so now we have a bright green note. We can get rid of it and make the accent normal. And if we were to drop note 3 into and we'll just give it an example. So note 4, and we'll go like this, and we'll make note 4 right. So if we drop note 4 into the full on add folder, you see it turns red. But if you add the pipe symbol, the or operation in front of the on the folder, and so now you're saying color color pipe equals red. What that means is if the attribute color, as in this case, already has the word green in it, or is not a default. That's the other thing. Whether or not if the attribute is empty, aka null, or is the default setting, if it's not the default, or if it has a value, like in this case, it's got a local value as a to the note. When I drag that over, it stays green. And so that is the operation that Dave Rogers was talking about. Now, where I personally find that really, really useful is not just in this messing around with colors, but if we go into here and we add in the prototypes and pop over to outline view. And let's say I have my own attribute, and we'll call this one P. Folder, and we'll give it the on add. And we'll say prototype pipe equals P folder. Okay, so what that says is if I add anything, and so if I go in here, I'll create a new folder, and I add new folder to that note. So anytime I'm going to add, if I hit the option key, I'm going to add a new, hit the shift key. What, I can't remember what it is. Is it come on. Yeah, if I had the shift key, that adds a child to the note. And did I do that right? Oh, I didn't call it folder. I called it P folder. Oops, it was lowercase p. Sorry, my cap box was on. All right, so now if I add a note, you'll see that this note has automatically adopted. Gotta give it a name. The on add function has automatically added the P folder item here. Now, if I go here and let's say I've got since Dave brought it up, Dave Rogers, and Dave Rogers is a person. So now if I drag Dave Rogers into this folder, his prototype doesn't change. And that's where I use that piping a lot, because I move notes around all the time, and kind of defaulting in my prototypes, any kind of on adds, I use the piping because I don't want to inadvertently drag a note into another note that might have some complex on add functionality. And I use really complex stamp structures and all of that. So just dragging something into a folder triggers probably often tens, if not hundreds of lines of code. And that little pipe symbol keeps it from having my attributes overwritten. So that's how you do.
That's the mechanical piece. The philosophical piece, or the design considerations piece, is as you consider attributes for whatever purpose in your Tinderbox file, you need to consider the fact that that the power of on add and action code can change those attributes. So if you're using a time attribute for a record keeping purpose of some kind, then presumably you want that time data to remain fixed at the time of creation. And that's when it's important, because it doesn't really change the prototype or anything. This is the data piece that you want to record and keep it fixed for the duration of the document, the existence of the document. It wasn't necessarily always clear to me that, and I don't know that I've actually had this issue. Whereas if you move that document out of or that note out of its container where the on add action established the time of whatever you were recording, move it out, move it back in, it will create a new, or that the current time and date, and the old time and date that was in there will be lost. So it's just what is the purpose of your attribute, and do you intend for it to remain fixed? And if you do, then you need to protect it at time of assignment with the logical or, which is a pipe and not an exclamation point.
Yes. All right. So does anybody else have any other best practices, tweaks or tips? I mean, I've got a ton.
Well, don't use the root level.
Yeah. Okay. So don't you? And why don't you explain what that means, Dave?
Well, you want to preserve you want a top level container that is sort of the base of your it gives you more flexibility going forward in the future. You don't want everything to begin at the 0th level.
So if I, just for those that are watching, if I create a new file and we go like this is the root level. And if I say note 1, that is a note. If I go note 2, drop it in, you're saying, and essentially that is a note within a container. And what I'm hearing you say is, if I'm using the root level, all of my notes, and which can happen all the time if you're in map view, you create a bunch of notes like this. And so you've got all these notes sitting at the root level. And why are you suggesting that that's not better or worse than saying than doing this?
For my purposes, it just gives you some flexibility in the future that you can always reorganize. But again, once you start reorganizing, you may be triggering on ad actions that you hadn't anticipated. But so you give yourself some flexibility by keeping that root level open to add additional functionality without impairing the existing structure that's already been built.
Yeah. So, and it really comes into play when you start getting to tens, hundreds, thousands of notes. Your root can get really messy, just like your desktop on your computer. And having some semblance of a foldering, containering system is helpful for your organization. So, as kind of what I hear you're saying, is that correct, Dave?
Yeah. So, like Captain's Log, the root level is just one container for Captain's Log. There are no other containers in the root level, and then everything that takes place beneath it, all the prototypes and so on, take place within that container. Now, if at some point in the future there was some other dimension to that document, then I could create that outside of that Captain's Log container and keep the document somewhat more condensed, organized. It gives you more flexibility, and they don't have to move everything to the right that already exists.
What I found with that, the opposite of that is, don't go too crazy and create too many nested folders, and because then you have the opposite problem of that, where you're now creating an artificial hierarchy structure that can be difficult to manage at some point. So there's this nice balance between some level of structure with containers and not so much forced hierarchy that it becomes the opposite happens, where it becomes difficult to find stuff or move stuff around. And I think there is a natural if to your point earlier about, think about how you want to use your attributes. There's this nice balance between the use of the foldering, containering structure for organizing your notes and using the values of your attributes to be able to find and discover and search your notes with tools like agents or find or attribute browser or things like that. So the attribute values of your notes can equally add to your structure when you're using the other views just as much as a container can in outline view. We can demonstrate that too if people are interested. Chuck.
Okay, I wanted to pick up on Dave's original observation, which is that having some best practices would be helpful to practiced users of Tinderbox, but also new users of Tinderbox. So I think that the process of developing some best practices and sharing them and having people comment on them and criticize them would probably be a constructive exercise for the community and would lead to some further learning. But let me pick up on both of Dave's points and try and extrapolate what the best practices issues really are. So we were just discussing the use of the root level of Tinderbox. And my observation is, first of all, the root level is already being used by Tinderbox. So if you add prototypes from the Tinderbox main menu, or you add stamps or action, you're going to wind up with stuff at the root level, which is not part of your main document. And so to a certain extent, setting yourself up right at the beginning to say, okay, there's the root level, but I'm going to work inside of a folder that is at the root level, but is where all my stuff exists, is not a bad starting point for people and might help them be less confused when they add a template and suddenly wind up with something else in the root they didn't understand what it was.
So for example, here are all of my notes in this file.
Right.
And then when I go up here and I add Tinderbox functionality like hints
Yes.
and templates, I don't know if this matters, right? I've now got 3 Tinderbox root level folders that have to be at the root level for Tinderbox to work. But I now have all of these other notes that are my notes scattered around, and that could get confusing. Is that what you're saying?
That is exactly what I'm saying. And I think that is an area that new users run into trouble. They say, oh, I need a template. And suddenly there's this extra thing. And their map, when they're just looking at the top level, it has got this extra crap in it. You know, from their point of view, I don't mean to say the templates are crap, but they're just a distraction would be the better term to use. So in terms of best practices, there are several things that could be recommended. One is what Dave suggested, which is just always have a container that's my stuff, you know, what your real document is about, and use that as your primary workspace within that document. You can create multiples if you want to, but then you're not confusing yourself with things that are infrastructure to the way that Tinderbox is going to operate.
Right. So let's pause there just to do that. So if I'm here, I'll do it over in this one since we're doing it. So I'm going to create a folder called My Stuff. And we can just move that stuff in here. And so now I have my stuff and I have Tinderbox's built-in elements. And we can go ahead and add the other ones in on this file. So we've got them. All right. There we go. So we have the kind of the 3 primary Tinderbox folders that need to be at root, and then you have my stuff.
Right. And then the other suggestion that relates to that. So if we're having a discussion about best practices, the other one that I see a lot of other people doing is also take those Tinderbox built-ins, prototypes, hints, templates, whatever else might come along, and make them separators. So as soon as you turn them into separators, they're still there, they're still visible, but they're distinctly different in a way that's useful from a semantic perspective. Furthermore, they don't show up in your map view. So those are some.
That's this note right here. Use separators to organize your outline or to hide some notes from the map view. Right.
Right.
So let's demonstrate that. So there's 2 ways to do that. So if you go up here to note and you create a separator, you can scroll and I'll show you my way and then we'll show you Chuck's way, which he's referring to. So I tend to like these here for whatever reason. I don't know why. So if and Chuck called it infrastructure, I tend to call it backstage, or you could call it infrastructure. And so anything that's like that backstage infrastructure, I put at the bottom of my outline and I have my separator there. And I use other separators to organize my other notes along those same ways. Now, when I do that, let's pop over to map view. If you look here, you know, those notes are still prototypes. Those notes are still on the map view. So there's my stuff, there's the hints folder, and there's the templates folder. So if you're on the root and you're looking at your notes, that can, you know, some people don't like that. Like Chuck doesn't like that for his personal point. So Chuck, how would you walk us through what would you do in this case?
I would just select prototypes, hints, and templates, and I would make them separators, which you can do from the white box there.
So if I go I go here, so we're clicking on the properties inspector, and you'll notice here there's a checkbox right here that's called a separator. And before we do that, one of the, again, I think this is really another important best practice or a best practice understanding for people to get. Every note in Tinderbox, as Mark said at the very beginning, is a, how did you word it, Mark? It's a collection of attributes.
Attribute value list is the.
Yeah. Go ahead. So as Mark said, Tinderbox, every note in Tinderbox is an attribute value list, and Tinderbox uses the values of the attributes in a note for it to function as well. So if you look here and I click on backstage, you'll see that separator, the separator attribute is set to true. If I turn it off, it's now not a separator. Separator, not a separator. So when I go that for Chuck's example, we can turn all of those into separators now. And so that doesn't change their functionality whatsoever in terms of outline. You see, we've got our backstage elements there. But what that does do is I don't know if it was an intentional design thing, but what it does is it hides those notes from map view. So separators are not displayed in map view. And that's a really great way of hiding certain types of infrastructure like prototypes, hints, and templates from the map view. Now, having said that, if you're new to Tinderbox and you accidentally do a separator on a note and a bunch of your stuff disappears in map view and you start freaking out thinking you just deleted everything, check that and make sure that, because if we go back here and we uncheck those, you'll see, and we go back, you'll see now, see they're back. And then if we check them and then refresh the screen, they're gone. So that's the use, a really nice best practice to help you organize your structures depending on how you want, whether or not you use my preferred method, which is backstage and have the notes underneath, or Chuck's, which turns those into separators and hides them. And I kind of like Chuck's too. I'm just not familiar with it.
Well, but you can do both actually.
And you can do both,
as you just demonstrated.
This right here.
Yeah, and in fact, I often do. But my point really was to what Dave originally brought up, which I think is an excellent observation, is that this is the kind of stuff that people new to Tinderbox aren't going to immediately perceive. And if there was a guide that said, okay, you're going to start out working in Tinderbox, here are some things you might think about before you dive into your next big project. And so, setting some of these things up and explaining these things in the context in which people use them, the practice, would be, I think, a worthwhile aid guide to a lot of users. If we pick up on the earlier point about the stroke equals or the or equals,
pipe, yeah.
The pipe equal, pipe is the Linux term for it. But that character has existed in typesetting for a long time, and it's called the stroke. But if you take that example, looking at it from action code is one perspective. But people may never see the other issue, which is if you're looking at attributes and how they behave, thinking about changing the behavior of a whole set of attributes through appropriate use of that code element in the built-in capabilities like on add is extremely instructive, and it gives you a different way of looking at it. So don't look at it from the action code perspective and operators list. Look at it from, if you have an attribute, here's how you can control its behavior under these circumstances. So it's coming at it from another point of view, which I think would be highly constructive to people. So that's I think the argument for putting forward best practices and suggesting things. I know that when I first started out with Tinderbox, that's what I started doing for myself. Was I started some notes, and they eventually became fairly elaborate on my observation about how things actually worked. What were the practices? What would I want to do with things? How would I want to interpret behaviors? And making that a group exercise, I think would be constructive and helpful to all of us. So that was the emphasis I wanted to place on it.
Yep. I got to step away just a second. I've got something in the oven. Excuse me.
Well,
Now's your chance, Dave.
I'll talk while Mark and Mike are both gone. Michael are both gone.
Yeah, while he's over.
Yeah. I think what I raised my hand for, as I mentioned, I wrote it down in the chat because I raised my hand earlier and immediately forgot what I was going to say. I'm at that age now where it goes in one ear and out the other. But if your Tinderbox file document is going to be a long-lived project, something that you're going to work in for, say more than a matter of just a couple of weeks, then perhaps having a mechanism for recording changes that you've made to the at least the action code portion of the document, so that you can certainly document the document within itself. You can create a note and give all the change log notes a prefix like CL or whatever you want to do. Create a prototype for the change log and then have an agent that gathers all the change log notes. So we've often referenced being kind to your future self. If you step away from the project for a few days or a week or so, you can come back and review the changes that you made previously and refresh your memory about why the document behaves the way it does now, which may not be exactly what you recall from before because you've been working in a different construct for a long period of time. So you should document your work, I guess, is the best practice. If it's going to be anything, a serious effort of any kind, you should learn to document your work within the Tinderbox file itself.
So when you say document your work, you document your processes, document your code. What can you explain that a little bit more?
So so you go in and take a particular container and you have a set of actions that you want to be incorporated in the onAdd attribute, and you refine that and you get it working the way you want to. Outside of that note, you should make a note of what you did and why you did it and why it was important to do it that way. And you should make that note, give that note a prototype of changelog or something so that it will eventually be gathered in a container by an agent of all your changes so that you can remember, you can go back. So many times I look at something I've done in Tinderbox and I can't remember how I did it. And I have to kind of reinvent the wheel again. Whereas if I had made more of an effort to document what I was doing at the time, I could have saved myself a lot of effort.
Yeah. Hey, by the way, thank you for that, Mr. Bernstein. Can you look what's going on here? Why is the screen? Is this a Tahoe thing? Why is the text not wrapping? And I'm getting this. Now it looks okay. Maybe it was. I think it was something to do with that. All right, looks like it's better now. Okay. Mr. Bruce.
I just wanted to follow up, Dave, on your point. Are you suggesting then, so it would be, because I do run into that problem. I've put something together. I'm pleased with how I've done it. A couple of months go by, I return to it, and I'm baffled. I'm not sure what is where sometimes. So are you suggesting that you would have a container of, I don't know, process notes or something separate from comments within the action code, and possibly those would link?
Whatever the practice, whatever floats your boat, I guess. What I'm thinking is right within the section that you're working on. Say you're in, Michael, pick a prototype note, pick person or whatever. So person can be a container, right? Now go ahead and add a container to that prototype. That's not going to affect the assignment of anything being assigned to prototype. That's just a container. Prototype just holds a container of notes, and you can make all your. So as you change the person prototype, you can document what those changes were within that prototype in separate notes. So you've got role underneath that. that's one. I'm not sure what your intention is there on that. I'm just, yeah, like a log thing. So in the person prototype, you've added on today, we added birthday in Julian date for some reason because Julian date was important. And so you come back a month later and you see this funny number in the person prototype and you don't know what JD means. You got a reference there in your change log. Oh, that was what that was for, because it makes math easier for something. I don't know. But that's kind of where I'm going. And certainly with any of the containers, if you make a change to the structure or a change to the attributes, you may want to make a note of what when you did that and why you did that. Certainly, if you observe a change in the behavior of the document, you can review those notes and see what might account for those changes. If you change the structure, if you move notes containers from one container to another, you may want to note that I moved this to here because of this. And then later on, you go back and discover something is catawampus, then maybe it happened when I did this. You can reconstruct what you did. Just document your work.
Just as an FYI though, if you add a note to a prototype like this, and let's say we'll call it Bruce Gale, and then I change Bruce to a person prototype, they're going to get that added.
Yeah.
That added folder. So that might not be the best place to put that kind of log. You might want to move that somewhere else, like change log. And maybe do this. Prototype. Right. And so that way, that could be your structure, something like that. It's however whatever works for you. But I just wanted to emphasize that because if someone didn't realize that functionality, that could confuse them.
Right. So to pick up on that thread, first of all, the point is extremely valuable. Speaking to your future self is always a good idea. But there are several approaches within Tinderbox for doing this. So we can have a whole category of best practices, which is we might talk about as saving your future self. One of them would be if you take the prototype, go click on person, if you can.
Yeah. All right.
And right there, over in the text window, in the right-hand side, is a place to put all kinds of documentation about person and how you use it. So just go click over in there and start typing things in.
You could,
and you could.
Okay.
Now, I'm just saying that works. If you have looked at any of the stuff I've done, I make extensive use of that. So that when you look at, how does the application get documented? In many cases, the documentation is right there in the things that are doing the work or that are important to the way that the application works.
Now, the challenge with this example though is text is an inherited value. So, or no, I guess it's not. So,
yes, it is.
Yeah. So why aren't these adopting?
Because you haven't updated them yet.
No, I just added the person. They should have adopted. Just something real quick.
Well, slide them out and slide them in and force the on add again.
No. I just added all of this text to the person at prototype, and I was assuming that the text would be adopted by Bruce and Dave Rogers' notes. Is that not the case? Is text not an inherited? I thought it was.
It would be if you created a new one or if you updated the inherited.
All right, so let's do that. Okay, so it does inherit, but if a person note already exists, then it's not going to get that text. And so that example though of adding all of those instructions in a note like this may not be great because maybe I want that text for this particular note person to be the person's bio.
Right. So again,
that's where you need to think through these kinds of things.
Right. That was where I was going to go next, was to observe that this approach is useful in the situation where having that text go into the prototypes is not a problem. And in many cases, if you think about how you're structuring what you're doing in Tinderbox, it's not a problem. In fact, it's actually and a help, because when you then go and look at something which is using the person prototype, there's the documentation on how you are using the person prototype in your document. And so it's a feature, and it's also a potential problem. And so best practices should point out both aspects of the issue to people. Telling them, you want to talk to your future self. How do you go about doing it? Here's one way to go about doing it. Here are the consequences of using that approach. If you don't like those consequences, what else could you do? So the other thing you could do is you could have linked notes to your prototypes, to your code, to various things that you want to document that are the documents that go along with it. Now, those links are a lot more flexible and give you a lot more control, but you can easily go from a prototype, for instance, to a link, which you might label document or documentation or project notes. That link can take you right to a note which is designed and separate from the prototype that would explain your use of the prototype and have a change log associated with it. So, these are all things that if we talk about the best practice, there are multiple best practices that people might employ, and like outlining what the options are and what you would do with them would be, I think, constructive. So these examples are all examples of ways that you could do it. And we've got a whole bunch of other ways that we could do it. And, I think that's the value of going through this exercise, what David suggested. Let me throw out one other thing, which I've run into a fair amount. And since we've got Mark Bernstein back on the line here, one of the things that I find a bit challenging with actual action code is that the note portion of the action code, the text, is actually your code. So when you start trying to document things, if you want to put in a lot of documentation about how a function works, for instance, or how a stamp works, you wind up doing it as comments. The comments, though, are in a monospaced font with no wrapping and a bunch of other characteristics, or not wrapping, which is useful. And so being able to have a standardized approach to binding program documentation to a bit of action code, I think would be a very helpful construct to think about. The tools are already there. I'm not saying that any new development is necessary, but maybe we could think about, what would be the best way to do it, given the way that Tinderbox works, and how would we outline this for people and show them examples of how to do it for their own purposes.
Yeah.
These are just suggestions.
Yeah, I wonder if a sensible thing to do is to have a comment and a title that has a link, a text link to the fuller documentation.
Yeah, exactly. Something like that would be a best practice. Doesn't involve redoing Tinderbox. It involves saying, if you have the problem, here's the suggestion of how to use the tools that already exist within Tinderbox to address your issue. So it's practice, not procedures, not policy, not anything else, not any of the other P words. It's how do you practice using Tinderbox? And I think that's where we get the value.
So I want to just jump in here real quick, Mike. I just want to point out, I think Michael's change logs container under the backstage separator is perhaps the most simple and straightforward kind of thing that even the novice could understand and begin to incorporate in their use of Tinderbox. It's very straightforward. It doesn't involve links. It doesn't involve like a lot of action code, but just developing a habit of adding a note within your change log. If you've changed anything in the document, anytime you've done that, add a note to your future self, what you did that day and the reason why. And then as you gain more sophistication, certainly you can do all the other things, linking remarks with comments within the code to other notes with more fuller explanations, but just as a basic beginning best practice, have a change log, and also perhaps have good backups.
Yeah, no argument.
So have a backup strategy is another, be kind to your future self. You know, and I use personally, I use Arc all the time. I love it. It's always there. It's always running. I actually had to use it yesterday when I screwed up a file and then was able to recover.
Is Time Machine the way it should have been built?
What? Arc is?
Arc
Yeah.
is Time Machine the way it should have been implemented.
Exactly. Arc is just fantastic.
And it works across platforms too, for people who don't realize it.
Yeah, I'll put the link in. All right. Anybody else have another best practice? Yeah, I'm looking for a link here. There you go.
One thing to include might be some hints about how to use Git with all of this if you're a kind of person who uses Git.
All right. You want to explain that a little bit?
So Git is a change control system, and recently Tinderbox works better with it, as I understand it. I have not explored this, so I can't describe the details. But since we're talking about change control and keeping track of what you change, one of the things is notes end up in the Git log about that. And so I would not recommend as a beginner best practice using Git necessarily, but there are those of us who sort of instinctively these days do an enormous amount of just checking things into Git because it's easy. So adding that as a to-do item for one or more of us to try to figure out might be interesting. That's all.
Maybe Michael, in the best practices container, higher level, we create containers for novice users or beginning users, or and then another container for the more advanced users, which I would put Git under, and maybe Arc.
Okay, so let's play with that. So this is how I would go about doing that, rather than, based on what we talked about earlier, rather than creating a nested hierarchy structure that could get really complicated. This is advanced or that's not advanced. We could call this one TBX best practice. We'll give it a little icon. What would be a good icon for a best practice? Star, maybe?
Yeah.
All right. So we've got TBX best practice, and then we say level, I guess. And we create a level, and we'll make it I can leave it as that. And then we can go here to our attribute browser and find. Let me open it up. There you go. And then we can say, like beginner. So just beginner and advanced. Okay. And so then we can go and assign that to all of these. Okay. And then we can assign a folder to this one. We say TBX best practice. So that way we can, so like the pipe system, would you say that was an intermediate, advanced, beginner?
Michael, before we go any further, you've got a misnaming between what you put into your on add and the actual prototype itself. Either add the P to that one or remove it from there.
Oh, yeah. So that's another best practice, by the way, is putty.
Consistent
No,
naming.
it's not a best practice. I disagree.
Consistent naming. That's another best practice.
I disagree. That's a religious conversation.
Like, well, maybe using a P is not the best practice for you, but or for somebody else. But the best practice is develop a convention for yourself and then be consistent.
Well, the convention is use the built-in labels and structures that are already there. So, you know, you don't need to put a P in a prototype because it's always, anytime you pop up the info window, you can see it's a prototype.
True, but
It's overloading.
The issue I have is name collision. I've run into name collisions with the naming of my prototypes and other notes in my file. So that's why I put a P there to guarantee that I don't have name collision.
Okay. I was just going to observe something about the Git conversation. Something I've toyed with, and I would, if anybody else wanted to work with me on it, I would welcome it. I have thought that there's no reason why Tinderbox couldn't have some applications built into it that would deal with Git repositories. And if we did that, we could make it easy for anyone who's using Tinderbox to take advantage of Git repositories for either data that they are importing or exporting from Tinderbox or for their actual Tinderbox files. So I throw that out as an idea. It's not yet a best practice, but you know, if people thought it was a good idea, maybe we can toss it around a little bit and see if we can come up with some strategies for building that capability into Tinderbox, because I think that might be actually pretty useful and would make Git much more approachable to the existing Tinderbox community. Just a thought.
Explain that a little bit better, because we did do a Git meetup back in September in Tinderbox, and how does that differ from just checking the Tinderbox file in and out using Git? What are you suggesting?
What I'm saying is, don't leave Tinderbox. Provide the capabilities to interact with the Git repository within Tinderbox itself. So Tinderbox and any further code you develop could automatically pull in information from a Git repository, check, get diffs for you on one version versus another, and put it into a note. Do a bunch of things that people do normally with Git. So basically, if you took Power, which is an application that gives you a well-defined GUI, graphical user interface, to work with Git, take some of those capabilities and build them into Tinderbox so that you can stay within Tinderbox and yet access and manipulate and use Git repositories in a way that is helpful to what people are doing with their Tinderbox documents.
Well, I believe
just a suggestion,
but you can do it per the meetup that I was just showing. You can use run command to interact with Git.
Yeah, and that's what I'm getting at is, yes, you can do that, but it's something that I think would elude the average user, and
correct
a more experienced approach and providing it as a capability that people can import and add to their documents might be a useful way to go, because getting people to know what Git commands to put into a run execution is a stretch for a lot of users for very good reasons. I mean, it's not a intelligence thing. It's just that there's a lot of experience you need to facilitate some of that stuff. So I'm just thinking it's a useful capability because Tinderbox is extensible. Maybe this is another case where we extend Tinderbox, not by asking Mark to build more code for us in Tinderbox itself, but by adding applications and structures that people can incorporate into their documents should they want to work with Git. So I throw that out as a suggestion. Yeah. It might lead to some new best practices down the road, but it's looking ahead rather than talking about something which is already in place.
I've thought about that. What frightened me is the prospect of providing emergency Git support for people who have encountered one of the problems from the wonderful comic book Oh Shit Git.
Yes.
It is a somewhat esoteric program with terms that people haven't seen before, like, do you want to pull or do you want to push? Uh, and I worry about that, but I do think that it may be a really good idea to just teach people what a commit is, and even if we just had support for local repositories, Mac OS, that would
Mhm.
get you a good part of the distance to having snapshot capabilities.
Yep.
So, so to return to kind of a more general, not just focusing on the change log, somebody up topic or in the chat mentioned Michael's Tinderbox config folder container. And I think, for anybody who's going to be bringing outside resources into their Tinderbox or exporting using outside resources, that Tinderbox config container is perhaps a best practice. And I don't think we've talked about that for a long time.
We have not. So let's pop that up. Okay. So the idea there is, and I always stick this as part of the, so you've got the built-in Tinderbox infrastructure, prototypes, hints, templates. And then in my backstage, I include a note called TBX config. And I put the little gear icon on it just to help me. Right. So that becomes like the config note I use for managing like default values and paths within my notes. And that would be another, while we're at it, we'll just do another working with images. And as Chuck's talked about, there's any number of different ways to do something. And what is best practice for one person is a horrifying waste of time for another. It just depends on what works best for you. But for me, what I do is I create all of my media in one directory on my folder, and I have and like a lot of the articles I write, I put in the pictures I have in a file in one folder on my directory. So that way I know all the images I use for articles I'm writing are always in the articles folder. So with that in mind, and this is not necessarily best practice, but just a function in if you're in Finder, and you can say, where is it? Show hide status bar. If I turn that off, turn that on. No, it's not status bar, it's path. Show hide path bar. So here's the path bar item in your Finder. So if I turn that back on, you'll see I've got a path. So if I do that, I can copy the path to this note. So if I copy this, for example, down here. If I right mouse click here, I can copy the path to that note. And so then that way, that allows me to create some defaults for my code. So if I go back here, I can create a Tinderbox config file called media path. Right. So that is an attribute I have in every one of my Tinderbox files called media path. And I know that my media path is always that. So that way later when I'm wanting to, and let's say I'm at this now and I say P media, and this is going to be a picture. Right. And so let's say now I want to create a picture. Trifina, and I'll turn that into P media. We go here and I'll say media file name. Right. That's another one of my methods. So I've got this picture here called Perfina P media. So all I need to do is populate the media file name here And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to, and this is getting a little extensive in terms of demos, but people can watch this again and figure it out. Where's my templates? I can go down here and I'll just use the HTML template. I'll create a P media file or T media. All right. So let's say I now want to display that image. So image source equals, and I'll say media path. Oh no, we're in export code, so I've got to use export code. Sorry. Media path, TBX config. So this is export code to tell Tinderbox to go out and oh no, shoot, sorry. I gotta look up. What am I doing wrong? I'm doing something wrong here. Let me just a minute. I'm having a minor brain malfunction. Think about this. I'm looking up another file real quick.
While you're thinking, let me just pontificate a moment.
Oh, I got it. It's value. Sorry.
Okay.
All right, I got it. So it's not, so it's export code. So I'm saying go get the value of TBX, of the TBX config note. And what I want is the media path. Right? And then I could say get the value of, and then the local attributes, media file name. And so what that's going to do is when I apply this template, it's going to pull the value of the from the TBX config note media path. And so the media path attribute value will always be defaulted whenever I'm using my notes, and I can always overwrite that as well. So that's an example of how to use a TBX config file. You go ahead, Dave.
Okay, well, the two things. One is Tinderbox can handle images within the content of the note text itself, and so that's one of the things that you should think about the role of your Tinderbox document. If it is just something that you are using locally on your machine, then you may not need to create a resource folder like that, which facilitates exports, I think, more than using them within the document itself. So I think that's something that you need to think about when you would want to use a media folder. The other part is on the config file are the API keys for various services that you may use on the internet that you integrate into your Tinderbox document. So I have a open weather API key. Is it open weather?
Yep.
Some people have their AI API keys. You can store your API keys in your config folder. Did we lose Michael?
Evidently. Whoosh.
Yeah,
Well,
sorry. I've got a loaf
Oh.
of sourdough bread that's cooking. So
Oh,
so it's
So Mark Bernstein, now that you have your marching orders next week. That's the price you pay for showing up.
And
Maybe the
blessing
week
to him,
after.
and blessing to him that he does it.
that
okay.
all
So
just went over my head. I don't know what that was about.
another way
Hey,
way to use the TBX config file, by the way, would be dates. So you could say like date today and date yesterday. So if you didn't want Tinderbox calculate, having to, individual notes to be having to calculate dates, the TBX config file could say, could use your rule, and I could say date today equals now. And date equals now minus 1 day.
Why minus?
Because I want it yesterday. No, would that not be correct?
Yep, nope, that's right.
Right.
Would you want to put the format in that config
And I need
attribute?
right. No, I don't need to, because what I'm doing is I'm populating values. So yeah, so today is November 16th and yesterday is November 15th. And so that way, if I'm doing some action code, doing some a note here, I wouldn't have to. I could just draw upon the TBX config file and say, "Go get me yesterday's date," and that way you're not having Tinderbox have to do And I ran into this before where I learned this is I was doing that date calculation at a prototype level, and I had over 1,000 notes that was recalculating today's date. And I realized I didn't need to have 1,000 notes doing the same action. I could have one note, TBX config, calculating the date, and then have the other 1,000 notes just look up the value from that one note. And it might sound trivial with a really super fast computer, but if you're doing that across thousands of notes, across thousands of operations, I found that I think I had like over 1 million unnecessary operations going on every second. So that was actually slowing my computer down. Chuck, you were going to make a comment?
Yeah. Doesn't Tinderbox already provide methods to get today's date and other than doing a calculation, it's dot code, date dot today.
Yeah, but if you're doing that it does. But if you're doing that at and again, there's different ways to get date. That was just one example of doing it. For example, you were saying I could have done dot code here instead of saying minus 1 day. You're right. I could have said
yesterday.
Date. What would it be? Date that yesterday? Something like
I think so. I said something like that.
Something like that. And that would be another way. Yeah, that would work. That would be another way of doing it. So if
you don't need the apostrophe at the end. That's
no,
you need a semicolon.
Yeah. So I do that. That performs the same operation, date dot yesterday versus now. But the point being is, if I had 1,000 notes running date dot yesterday, I don't need to be. It takes processing power. Whereas I can just have TBX config do that date dot yesterday once, and then have the other notes just looking up the value. And again, at smaller files, that doesn't make a difference. But with some of my notes that have thousands of notes and hundreds of lines of action code, it actually starts making a difference.
Okay, so I got to ask Mr. Bernstein how much difference in efficiency there is between looking up the attribute value that you shared, that you established, versus just doing date dot yesterday. I would assume they're pretty equivalent from a computational point of view, but maybe not.
I'm not sure whether we still instantiate a new calendar object for each date calculation. And you wouldn't think that grabbing a calendar object would be really complicated, but calendar objects turn out to be more complicated than I realized.
Yeah.
So it's possible that that's an unnecessary tax on date calculations. Uh, another example here might be a situation where you're assembling a string prefix that's going to be computed from 3 different attributes and compressed and then slammed into the display expression of a bunch of notes or into the name of a bunch of notes. And it may be simpler to make the intermediate variable of the thing you're going to prepend and then just copy that into a lot of notes.
Yes. And that's a better structuring as well. But no, I was just, I think this is one of the things that issues that, in effect, Michael brought up the question of what about performance? And best practices could also guide people toward approaches that might not make any particular difference, but that could wind up with better performing Tinderbox code. Those are the kinds of things that would be useful hints for people who go into things. So if somebody's saying, gee, I need to fool around with a lot of dates, having some best practices guidance on where the trade-offs are from a computational point of view with lots of date calculations and showing some examples of something that is expensive computationally and something that is less expensive computationally would be the extremely valuable guidance to users.
Well,
Well,
on that note, go ahead, Dave, and then I'll stop.
Well, I just want to caution anybody who may be new to Tinderbox and is viewing this document, understand that date.today as defined here is going to give you today's date in that attribute every time you look at that file. If you want date.today to be today's date today and every day and to remain the same for every day going forward, don't calculate today's date. Sign today's date to an attribute that will remain fixed. Do you understand?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, hopefully the novice understands. So David Eddy's has had his hand up. I'm
a novice. I understand.
I'm almost at the end of battery. And Mark Bernstein, when you set off on this journey, did you contemplate that people could have supercomputers on their desk?
Well, we knew there'd be big computers on their desk. And from the beginning, one of the goals of Tinderbox has been to actually use that computational power.
Right, but it also comes with these very complex issues of change control, i.e. Git, proper use of dates. These are just, fantastically complex things that the normal civilian who just plopped down, a couple grand on a computer and Tinderbox just isn't thinking about.
Yeah.
But the kind of expert that picks up Tinderbox is basically wrestling with their own very personal complexity of their hobby.
Well, everyone wrestles with complexity at the edges of their understanding.
Right.
And that's just the way it is.
Okay,
Different people have different edges.
But, getting back to what Dave suggested at the beginning, which I think is the really important point of this whole conversation, there would be value to the community if we started thinking about sharing ideas about best practices, because things have gotten complex. Tinderbox is not storage space anymore. And, there are a lot of complications. There are a lot of applications people are putting it to that were never intended. Oh, I don't know, something like AI, something like using a Git repository. These are all things that probably were never anticipated at the beginning, but they add complexity. And in the context of great complexity, having some guidance that allows people to say, if I'm going to go down this path, what I like to know before I go too far is extremely valuable guidance. And I think the Tinderbox community would benefit from pulling together more of this. Yeah.
People will absolutely love it.
Here's a
Yes,
modest proposal. At one point, we had an idea that at every one of these meetups, somebody would undertake to explain some particular portion of Tinderbox, an article from ATB I would propose that perhaps at the beginning of every meeting, because the ends we never know where they're going to go, we take 10 minutes, the first 10 minutes, to review this, have this document open on Michael's machine every week. We have a week to think about this, and we can offer any changes, inputs, additional best practices to this document, upload it to the forum every week as it gets revised by us, the community air quotes, and make it a living document. And, you know, it might encourage people to join into the meetup, maybe not. But I think that if we keep this front and center for a while, we can build something of real value. And I think we've made a good start today.
I like that a lot. I like that a lot. While we have one few minutes, I got one more kind of, again, is it a best practice or is it a learning of efficiency? And maybe Chuck, you can, and David, you can help me get a better word for it. But what I found for myself as a best practice is, you know, you can, you know, run a lot of code and such in your Tinderbox files and notes. And I'll grab some code for this from one of mine as an example. I can pull it up here, for example. And what I do is, rather than having, and I don't necessarily need all of the action code that I create for my notes running on every single note at all times when I have thousands of notes. So I created this. So for example, when I'm running, I've got a prototype I call P-Page, and you know, I use a whole methodology I call short titling and renaming the file names and such like this. And I don't need this action code running constantly as a rule or an edict every few seconds or every few minutes. I only actually need it triggered when I actually am visiting that note. You know, when I'm actually interacting with that note. And so when I interact with that note, I want it to update itself with all of the code that's triggered by this activity. And what I ended up figuring out was, I can go like this, and I'll create a P-Page attribute just so we've got it in this file. And we'll call this one, whoops, page. No, let's use this one. Okay, so and it's not in the inspector menu. So you know, you have different actions when you're triggering action code. You can, a rule is running every minute or every few seconds. And on remove is when you're removing something from a container. And on add is when you're adding something to container. And edict is something that's running about once an hour. And so if you go up to the quick stamp and do on visit, what I figured out was I could type a stamp, and I could say stamp, quote that. So when I apply that to the note, anytime I visit that note, Tinderbox stamps the note with this on visit stamp and runs that code for me. And so then that way that code is only running when I visit the note. And going back to the point earlier on processing power, you know, it just makes Tinderbox not have to be constantly recalculating things over and over again unnecessarily. And again, when you've got 10,000 notes running hundreds of lines of code, it does slow things down. And this one, and that's how I figured out how to not have my file slow down. Chuck, you look like you were ready to make a comment.
Just that on visit is an example of where I think guidance on best practices would be extremely useful. So it's just another example of something that people are not going to initially appreciate and understand why they'd want to use it. But, you know, saying a best practice would be to use on visit for these types of purposes would be, I think, very helpful. We also have on paste now, which is another fascinating option for dealing with how you manipulate notes. So
and those are,
you know, go ahead.
On paste, what is that one again? I don't remember that.
on paste.
Yeah.
I don't know that one.
That was something added not too recent. I use it, unless I'm forgetting what it's called.
No,
but when you paste,
I forgot how to use it though. What does it do?
When you paste into copy a note from one document, you paste it into another document.
Yeah.
On paste can execute when you paste it into the other document. That's how I do several things.
So it's an action code trigger. On pace is an action code
Right.
trigger.
The package manager that I put together makes extensive use of that, or not extensive, but it is enabled by that capability.
Mhm.
But people aren't going to. What would I do with on paste until you show them some examples or explain something? These are all. You can go to ATBRef and ATBRef will tell you what it is. But the current situation doesn't guide people to go look for the right things in ATBRef. And so we have reference documentation, we need guidance documentation, which is what I think Dave was saying. And I think the suggestion to try and work on this as a community is an excellent one. Enough said.
One quick idea on organizing some discussion in the forum would be to have individual forum topics for the individual parts of this so that we're not arguing about 15 different ideas in the same thread.
Mhm.
All right. So by the way, Chuck, going back to what you said, so ATBRef tells you what something is or how to use it. It does not necessarily explain why or provide scenarios for how to use it or to use it.
Right. I mean, sometimes Mark Anderson does include some examples, and that's always very valuable. I'm just observing that there's a difference between reference material and usage guidance. And best practices is usage guidance.
Mm-hmm.
And you see this in software documentation all the time. There's the reference material, which is dry and often difficult to work through with, but whenever you want to look up what a function does or what a code element does or how a file is supposed to be structured, you go to that kind of document and it gives you the specific information you need. But how did you get there? How did you know that was something you wanted to do? That's where practices and guidance comes in. And we have a lot of this kicking around. It's just that I think things have matured and evolved enough that taking a more procedural approach to building best practices would be a good idea.
Absolutely.
Just
All right,
comment,
guys.
as a developer, over the years, I've taken to reading the damn documentation before I needed it, just to get in my head the set of things that are out there. Of course, there's very little detail retained, but
yeah,
it's painful.
Having seen it once, you are better armed to deal with it when you confront it.
Yeah.
All right, everybody. Well, thank you very much. This was a fun dialogue today, and we will see you next week.
Sounds good.